Well, the man who has called out the government's record spending and the rising constraints that it faces from the mounting budget deficits and debts is independent economist Chris Richardson, who joins me now. Chris, many thanks for your time. You and I have both been around long enough. We've kind of almost seen this scenario play out before. We've got current account deficits, we've got a vulnerable currency, we've got commodities going backwards, we've got debt and deficits coming, we've got interest going overseas. Really, a circuit breaker is almost needed in Australia, isn't it?
Yeah, and that combination says a grumpy public off the back of the drop in living standards that we've seen. And that makes it tricky for governments. There are things that they would genuinely like to do, like to change, but with that backdrop and with a grumpy public, they're not being courageous one way or another.
And as I make the observation, the coalition is showing no real signs at this stage that it's got a zeal for any reform or change to shake up the tax system, to shake up labour laws, to shake up productivity. And then if you get the worst outcome, which is a hung parliament with the Greens potentially having some influence or Teals having some influence, again, you get the sense that we're not going to get the genuine reform that Australia's after.
Follow the incentive. It's what an economist is always going to say. Look at the incentives. Oppositions, both sides in opposition, and you see it around the world. If you keep saying no, that's a highly successful strategy. It's not as though the opposition has spelt out alternative policies in any great detail. And on some of the big dollar stuff, we might hear some more detail, maybe even sometime soon, but I'm not really expecting courage there either. And as you say, a hung parliament is not a courageous parliament. There are great independents. The small parties often champion good things, but again, follow the incentives. They have incentives to grandstand on popular issues, and that just makes it hard for the country as a whole to make progress.
Given the fact that big business, which has called out the government this week, the president of BHP, the chief executive of Wesfarmers, some of our biggest employers and taxpayers, have basically called out the government, saying that they feel as though it's becoming more anti-business. It's harder to do business here. So there's no business investment. In the absence of that, government has stepped up to actually do most of the investing in this country. But that's centralising the economy. That is not really what an open economy such as Australia has been used to over the past couple of generations.
Ultimately, our living standards come down to being more productive over time. And new technologies, all sorts of things can help with that. But you need business putting their money where their mouth is so that the workers of the future have better computers, better factories, better roads, better all sorts of things to work with. You need governments having courage to then further turbocharge that, taking some difficult political decisions, things that they may not be loved for, but do need to be done. That combination missing in Australia. Our productivity has not moved upwards since 2016. And our living standards today where they were in 2014. We are getting what we deserve.
One of the points about a more centralised economy being more reliant on government for jobs, for policy, for industry policy, for example, with the government subsidising it with its future made in Australia. One of the great difficulties of that is it crowds out private enterprise. It's actually taking the employees that might otherwise be working for private enterprise to build roads, to build bridges, to build new infrastructure, which might be necessary, but it comes at a cost.
It does, and that's a great point, and it's a point I think not enough people understand right now. A bunch of people and the government say, well, if the feds and the states hadn't jumped in with a whole lot of extra spending in Australia, we'd have had a recession. That's not the right way to think of it. In an economy where there's lots of unemployment, where the Reserve Bank is out of ammo, that is a moment where governments absolutely should jump in, boots and all, and help out and make a big difference. But we are today in a trade-off economy, an economy that has still a bit too much inflation, is one that if governments throw extra money at it, we run the risk of more inflation than we'd otherwise get. Our alternative wasn't recession. Our alternative was a Reserve Bank able to cut interest rates. Now, the change has been in the mix in the economy. Other things equal, taxpayers are better off, they got theirs. Electricity payers, for example, are better off, they got theirs. Borrowers are worse off.
So let's go to that Reserve Bank, because remember that it's this government, Jim Chalmers, that changed the policy of the Reserve Bank to look not just at inflation, but also to try and maintain full employment. But that also came at a cost. Australia's economy, unlike New Zealand or the United States or Europe's, did not go into recession. It seemed the government was shy about wanting to be responsible for an official recession. But the cost is that now interest rates are staying higher for longer, and indeed it's taking longer for inflation to be washed out of our economy. And we know that because, again, we're seeing it this week with the Reserve Bank with another rate decision, which almost undoubtedly will be on hold.
I have to say that this week's national accounts did show sufficient weakness that whereas I previously thought we wouldn't see a rate cut until May, it does open the door back again for February markets. Roughly saying February's a 50-50 chance. That's probably higher than I'd put it, but February is possible. But the basic point that you have made, that Australia deliberately went more carefully in the fight against inflation, that was the Reserve Bank trying very hard to preserve a bunch of jobs, and they've succeeded in that. But the flip side is inflation stays on for a little longer than the countries that went harder. Then when you add to that state and federal governments throwing in a bunch of extra spending, that further makes the Reserve Bank's task hard here compared to what you are seeing elsewhere around the world.
OK, so then we get a government that right now becomes constrained because of the debt and the deficits that are mounting up for the next decade, both at a state level but also at a federal level. It at some stage means that government services are going to be compromised. They don't have the extra cash. They don't have the extra capacity to be able to keep spending on whatever is their favourite project. And that also on the back of families having their own sort of personal circumstances going backwards for nearly 2 years now, that is going to affect a lot of families.
And to be fair, I'd have to say that government debt in Australia is much less of an issue than it is, for example, in the US. Now, partly that's we got lucky. The combination of war, inflation and migration has had a really big impact on the tax take in Australia. Unlike most rich countries, we sell commodities and their price goes up amid war and other conflicts. We've benefited off the back of that. We're seeing migration at a pace that the bulk of the rich world isn't. That gives a bigger pie for the feds to tax. And inflation, particularly in Australia, is a tax. You know, it takes money from families and gives it to governments. That combination means that our government debts are looking much healthier than you see in much of the world. But the turn is coming. You know, the times have been too good because those factors gifted the current government a surplus. It just made it a little easier for it to be a little lazy about its decisions. 104 billion in its decisions net added to spending, 44 billion net added to taxes. Higher taxes as an offset. That gap is 60 billion net overall. The decisions to worsen the budget. That's a decision, but you have to place that decision against the thought that we've seen bursts of luck before, even if this is the most spectacular one we've had. And the oldest mistake that governments make during a burst of luck is making permanent promises off the back of temporary good news.
And yet all that spending, the extra spending, $104 billion that you mentioned, and yet households have been in recession for 7 months. And so as a result, they're not happy right now, despite all of the government spending, despite the government telling them that you should feel OK about all of this. We've given you tax cuts. We've given you cost of living relief. So therefore, my question really is there much more the government can do right now?
You would love to see our politicians pushed in the direction of their better angels by our institutions, by our Reserve Bank that you can't push around too much or it raises rates, by Treasury and Finance, who get their one and only moment in an electoral cycle once the election has been called. Treasury and Finance report not to the government of the day, but to the Australian people with a pre-election fiscal outlook. Or the Parliamentary Budget Office, they get the chance to cost some policies. But our problems are, there's given events, after all, inflation is coming down. Chances are the Reserve Bank is not going to raise rates, so that will tempt both sides to spend. Chances are that Treasury and Finance will do as they normally do and not go hard in their commentary in a pre-election outlook. And chances are that both parties will hide their more controversial, more expensive policies from the Parliamentary Budget Office. Our institutions are great, but they may not entirely protect us from the worst instincts of our politicians.
The worst instincts of our politicians. Well said. Chris Richardson, always good to chat to you, and many thanks for your time on the program today.
Thanks, Ross.